Hi team, here's a bit of a debrief on this year's federal budget for VCE Economics students. All right, so first we're going to start with a macroeconomic overview, and we always want to start with kind of the budget outcome. And we refer to the budget outcome as the underlying cash balance. And you'll see in the blue section is this year's underlying cash balance outcome. And you'll see there is a small deterioration in dollar terms from 28.3 to 31.5 from last year to this year. But you'll see here the percentage of GDP has remained the same at negative 0.1%. And remember, we want to look at that percentage as a true indicator of the amount of expansionary or contractionary impact that this will have on the economy. And so based on last year, it should have a similar expansionary effect on the economy. That language may not make sense to you yet, expansionary, contractionary, but it will soon. I want to go through some of the charts that were in the budget outcome resources, and you'll see here's a lot going on in this chart, so I'm going to break it down for you. So 2026-27, which is the current budget, is this one here. And what you're going to find here, this is the kind of summary of where the budget balance comes from. And so you're going to see here we've got a structural budget balance here, which is the key components in the budget, the actual policies. And then the green one here is a cyclical factor. Now, if you remember what we learned about with the cyclical and structural factors, the cyclical ones are the ones that are in line with the business cycle. And these will be the ones that align with the concept of automatic stabilizers that we've learned. And the structural budget balance, think of it like the policies, which are your discretionary stabilizers. And you'll see here the main reason we have an overall 1%, negative 1% of GDP budget deficit is overwhelmingly the spending of the policies that are in this particular budget. You'll see over time the estimates on where the government will hope to return the budget to surplus all the way in early 2030. They're really just crystal balling there, and I wouldn't trust those numbers because the world is what it is. Let's have a talk about debt though. So we've learned about the impact of budget deficits on public debt. Again, this first dot point here is the left of that is what has happened, and then you'll see right of that is what's happening. You'll see there's been a fall in public debt or as a percentage of GDP, not in dollar terms, but as a percentage of GDP since COVID. And then you'll see over recent years, there's been a slight uptick, and mainly that's just due to the ongoing and persistent budget deficits. We've got this thing called the MYEFO, which is a mid-year economic fiscal outlook. I want you to think of that like as a halfway check. And the halfway check last year, which was in October last year, had our estimates of debt as a percentage of GDP on this blue line. And then you'll see the revisions that they've made to the budget this year, specifically in the areas of NDIS spending, National Disability Insurance Scheme spending, which we're going to talk about, have brought those estimates down. It's still a high level of public debt, but you'll see they've drawn down their estimates on what that debt would be on what they had predicted before. Then on the right-hand side here, and this is all government government messaging that's coming out from the government, just to show you, look, while these numbers look pretty bad when you actually compare our amount of debt to GDP ratio compared to other international developed countries, we are, and this is true, significantly lower than those other countries. You can see United States actually have more debt than actual GDP each year, which is a terrifying, terrifying position to be in. Okay, so here's some key initiatives for the current budget, and you'll be needing to use these and remember these in your responses and the impact on these on certain economic concepts. So the first one here that we're going to talk about is generally changes to income tax. And there's two main initiatives that the government is utilising this year. The first one is a $250 tax offset for all Australian workers. This is essentially when you submit your tax return, you'll pay $250 less than you would ordinarily, or get a $250 refund if you didn't have to pay any extra tax. The other one is a tax rate cut on low income earners. So that low income marginal tax rate is going to fall from 16% to 14% over the next 2 years. both of these policies, and the main theme of this budget really is rebalancing the amount of contributions that people make in tax between those that earn their income from working and those that earn their income legitimately and legally from investments. And so there was a feeling from the current government that potentially that those earning their income from working were doing too much of the heavy lifting, and those earning their income from investments were getting relatively less contributions to the taxation system. And so this one and another one I'm going to talk about in a little bit is designed to rebalance the contribution of tax from those that generate their income from working versus those that generate their income from investments. And so both of these are economic policies. So the intent of them is to change economic impact. And these are the impacts that these two policies will have. So we're going to see an increase in private consumption and therefore an increase in aggregate demand, because the government is essentially reducing the leakage of tax. And for most people, when they get this extra money or don't need to pay as much tax, they're going to spend that in the economy. As a result, that's going to create widespread shortages, putting upwards pressure on inflation. And unemployment is going to put downwards pressure, because when those people spend that extra money in the economy, that's going to generate an increased derived demand for labour. Now, since this is reducing the amount of receipts that the government is receiving, this is actually contributing to pushing the current budget outcome into deficit, because that receipts number is lower. And as a result, as we've already learnt, when receipts fall relative to expenditure, receipts fall or expenditure rises, and that pushes us in a budget deficit, well, then that's going to increase the amount of debt. The government is going to need to borrow more money to cover this particular fall in receipts. The next one we've got here is the property tax changes, and this is the cornerstone of the current government's budget, and the most controversial one that you hear in the media. We're just choosing to focus on one aspect of their property tax policy, mainly because it can be quite complex. If there's other parts of this that you have learned because you're talking about it at home or you've read about it, you can absolutely talk about those. But we've chosen here to go on the changes to negative gearing. Now, negative gearing, I'm not going to go into in this particular video. We're going to talk about that in class. But essentially, this is incentivizing investors to invest in homes that are newly built only. And this is designed to reduce the demand on existing home stock to allow those low-income earners and new entrants to the property market to be able to afford those properties. There's been a lot of different modelling going on around. Generally speaking, most house prices are not going to fall backwards. If they do, it won't be by much. In certain areas that are overinflated, they probably will see some softening. But the idea here behind this broad tax policy is to allow wages to catch up to housing prices and allow younger people, which is you guys, and low-income earners to actually access the housing market. And this idea of negative gearing only applying to new homes is to incentivize the production of an increase in supply of housing, which again should put some downwards pressure on house prices. So this one I've classified as a well-being policy. So this one hasn't necessarily been done to drive any government budget outcomes or, raise a lot of revenue. Relatively speaking, it's not going to raise a whole lot of revenue for the government here. It will raise more revenue because it will be increasing the tax on new investments that aren't on new homes. And so that will provide some revenue for the government, but not a whole lot to really shift the needle. The effect on AD is going to be unknown here. And so it depends on, will those people who are now getting taxed more on their properties, and again, existing properties aren't impacted by this, by the way, it's only new properties that it applies to. If you buy a house that is an existing house and it's an investment for you, you're going to be paying more tax than you would have otherwise. And so that will increase leakages out of the economy. But will that be substantial enough to offset the gains that will come from incentivizing new house builds? And so we will see some softening of private consumption, but we probably should see some increase in new home builds as a result of this. And so what the net effect of that will be, nobody knows. And I'm not here to tell you or give you a guide of what that will be. Overall, though, this will put downwards pressure on inflation. And the reason for that is this will put a softening of growth in the housing sector of housing and housing related expenses. Unemployment is a question mark again because we don't know the net effect on AD. There will be some decreases to AD and there will be some increases. Who knows? If this does have a profound impact on the building of new homes, well, then that will increase jobs in the construction and related industries. But it's a little too early to tell on that one. Overall, since this is going to increase taxes at the end of the day, this will help push the budget outcome closer to surplus and help relieve some of that debt pressure. Our next big hitter is NDIS eligibility. So NDIS stands for National Disability Insurance Scheme, and it's essentially a program designed to assist people to live a comfortable and fulfilling life if they have a severe or permanent disability. And since the Julia Gillard government, which introduced this, there has been an escalation of spending in this particular area, mainly because the criteria to actually receive this spending was quite loose. And so they have tightened the eligibility criteria on how people can receive this particular money. This is an economic policy, even though it relates to looking after people with disabilities, and some people with less severe disabilities will be negatively impacted by this. But the reason they've done this policy is literally to save cash. It's just as simple as that. Since they're pumping less injections into the economy in regards to this NDIS funding, there will be a fall in private consumption and investment of this disability-related spending. And as a result, there will be now widespread shortages created in those particular industries, putting downwards pressure on inflation. Unemployment, as a result, there's going to be a slight uptick in unemployment in these health and disability sectors because there's going to be just less funding in these areas, and so there's going to be job layoffs. This will significantly and has pushed the outcome closer to surplus. You're going to see there, this particular policy, the number you see on the little tile up there is over 4 years. But over 4 years, this is going to save the government nearly $40 billion in expenditure. So this is a key contributor. Remember that chart I showed you before, how they had planned for a certain amount of debt and it really dropped? It's because of this main policy is the reason that their total level of debt is falling, which should reduce the increase in debt, if you like. It puts downwards pressure on the amount of debt. And our final policy, which we're going to revisit in Unit 2, is this $3.8 billion in the suburban rail loop. This is a Victorian-specific policy where the government's investing in rail infrastructure. This is also an economic policy, and this will absolutely increase aggregate demand. In the short term, it's just going to be straight government spending, laying railroads, getting steel, getting people to, create the stations and all that kind of stuff. And then in the short term, that's going to put upwards pressure on inflation because of those resource widespread shortages. I've said in the short term because in the long term, this should have a downwards pressure on inflation as it is a infrastructure policy. It should allow more and easy free movement of goods, services, and resources around the economy, which will help increase our productive capacity, putting downwards pressure on inflation in the long term. But hold off that thought for Unit 2. Unemployment, as I said, will put downwards pressure. We need people to build these stations and trains. And since it's a significant investment, this pushes the budget outcome further into deficit, therefore increasing debt. And then if you can get all this right, you will be as happy as our Prime Minister here and our Treasurer swinging hands outside Parliament. What a joyous, joyous time to be alive. Any questions, please come see your teacher. Otherwise, happy budget.